Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of this year of the Skills Lab Network on how to translate skills demand evidence into effective policies. Thank you for joining us today. Just a few technicalities about this Zoom meeting before we start. Kindly remember to keep your microphone muted during the presentations, and you will have a possibility to ask questions to the speakers anytime using the chat box or during the question and answer slots, which are foreseen after each session. And you can use the raise your hand button whenever you wish to speak during the question and answer. I would like just to share a few updates on the Skills Lab network. As most of you know, the network was launched in 2021, bringing together in a common platform researchers and experts on in the field of skills demand, who are interested in discussing and exchanging on skills demand, skills anticipation methodologies, and how future skills are changing. We now have around more than 800 members from the partner countries where the ETF is working, from EU member states and even beyond. So the network has really taken shape as a global forum to discuss skills issues. Also, I would like to share a few words about the work plan for this year. In addition to the three events which took place already, the first webinar in February on integrating artificial intelligence into technical vocational education and training, and the annual live event we held in Florence last March on the focus from skills anticipations to policy action. We are planning a number of activities, basically one each month. The first upcoming will be next week, regional webinar focusing on Southeastern Europe and Turkey on the visibility and value of skills in algorithmic managed work. This will be followed in June by a regional webinar on the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean region, focusing on the attractiveness of the technical vocational education and training. There will be online peer learning sessions end of June and end of November, online informal networking sessions and activities of our sub-thematic communities. As you know, we are continuing the one on the skills dimension of migration, and we are likely to launch a new one in the second part of the year, focused on tracking of graduates as a tool for skills anticipation. We are keeping connected and through the open space and the LinkedIn group, which is proving to be a really powerful tool to exchange on events and on news on skills anticipation. And I really encourage you all to use this tool. I will post in the chat the link in case you are not yet there. Now, let's enter into today's topic, which is how to translate skills demand evidence into effective policies. I was mentioning a few seconds ago the live event in Florence, where the network met in person to discuss how to strengthen the link between skills anticipation, skills evidence, and policy actions. There were very interesting discussions at the event, highlighting that the main bottleneck is not the availability of data and evidence, but the translation of this evidence into clear policy messages. Therefore, from the event, the key points, which was, let's say, the key takeaways, was emerging as a key priority was the need to strengthen the interface between researchers and policymakers through shared frameworks and the continuous dialogue. So building on the conversations in Florence, today we wanted to explore further how evidence can be effectively translated into policymaking. So how can evidence be transferred into policy messages. A brief glance through the agenda. We will start with an introduction by my colleague Umuhan Bardak, who will frame the topic and provide the context on the use of evidence for policymaking. We will then have with us Mrs. Anastasia Degliacuri from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, who will address the topic on how to reach evidence-informed policymaking. Anastasia will present us practical tools and frameworks developed within the JRC. And then, last but not least, we will have a possibility to listen and interact with two cases, concrete cases from two countries through our speakers from Armenia and Moldova. After each of these presentations, there will be a question and answer session, so that will be an opportunity for all of us to ask questions to the speaker. Now, before passing the floor to the first speaker and the facilitator, I suggest we take a group pictures. So if you wish to be in the picture, just please turn on the camera for a second and then you can switch it off again. And I kindly ask the colleagues Eda and Chiara to take a picture and tell us when it's done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eda. I'm now pleased to pass the floor to our facilitator, Ms. Branka Angelkovic, the network's facilitator for Southeastern Europe and Turkey, who will introduce and facilitate the first session. Branka, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiana. Good morning from my end as well. Welcome all. It's a pleasure to see you today. I guess that many of you were with us in Florence, but for those who were not, I guess that you will hear phenomenal insights, not only from the sessions in Florence, but also follow up to these sessions and further reflections. As Christiana said, my name is Branka Angelkovic, and I'm the regional facilitator for Southeast Europe and Turkey. I will be facilitating this webinar together with my colleague Began Chiazzo, regional facilitator for Central Asia. And before I actually give floor to Umuhan, just a quick note to all speakers. I'm known to be a tough facilitator, so I will intervene 1 minute before time is up, so you can bring your remarks to close. I think that this is a fair deal, so forgive me for my interventions in advance. Now, as I've said, it is a pleasure to give floor to Umuhan Bardak, Senior Human Capital Development Expert from the European Training Foundation. She will introduce the topic of today's webinar, but also she will frame the discussion that is ahead of us today. Umuhan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's very nice to be with you. Well, I will try to be very short. What I will talk to you is a bit of our experience in the ETF with implementing projects, many projects, starting from the beginning to the end, most of which link to the policy-oriented research, basically. Can you please move the slide? The main idea is that we, as a EU agency working in the education and training policies and employment policies, we very much like to link the research to the policy. And although ETF is not a research institute by itself, I mean, this is left to the universities and research institutes, but we still do some research. But research is done for the objective of policy making, to use evidence from the research in designing policies or adjusting policies, monitoring and evaluating policies. So we generally always, well, not generally, always remind that knowledge production or evidence is only the first step of this whole process. before it is going to be used further. And then at the end of the process, as you see in the slide, we expect this evidence to be used somehow for developing a policy, implementing, monitoring on, or evaluating a policy. But in between, there is also another intermediate step, which we often miss. Because when we produce evidence, we do our research and publish our report or make a presentation. It's not automatic that this information is immediately usable by policymakers. There must be a knowledge broker in the middle who can interpret and disseminate or package this knowledge, newly created knowledge, into an intelligence which can be easily implemented by the policymakers. Please, next to the slide. We have seen a lot of challenges in transforming information into policy. The first one is generally starts with the early selection of the research topic. Research has to be linked to the existing issues, challenges, policies in a given country. If it is something completely irrelevant from the policy agenda of the country, this attracts less attention from the policymakers, obviously. The next one you need to click, I think. Yes. The second is that we do the research, we make a report, but the results are very general. They can be also too technical for non-experts, or they can have a low reliability or accuracy for the results, which prevents also decision makers to take it easily and implement it. Please click all the yes. The third one is lacking support from the key stakeholders on the topic of research. This could be if you are working on education policy, for example, education related issues. It's obvious that you need to have support somehow, or in relation, in communication, in networking with the stakeholders in this field. If they are not involved, like Minister of Education or like schools, like anything linked to the teacher association, etc., then you will lack the ownership of your research. Moreover, you will probably not have enough funding, etc. This is also linked to the stakeholders who are generally less knowledgeable about the scientific aspects of your research. If they lack the technical knowledge, for example, in the field, like skills anticipation, it will be difficult for them to understand the mechanisms behind your research or evaluate the results properly. Please, next slide. Still challenges. And this is not only limited to few countries. Go back, please. Institutional silos is very common. We see almost in every country. We always talk about, the lack of relations on communication between the ministries of labor and ministries of education, for example. I'm sure it is the case in your country. I can tell you it is the case in my country, and I think it is the case also in many EU member states. It is difficult because generally institutions have this mentality of working in silos, because it requires a lot of coordination to cooperate among the institutions. Normally, institutions have their own scattered responsibilities, and if there is weak interinstitutional coordination, it's very difficult to do something together. But on the other side, the research you did normally requires many institutions to come together to be used meaningfully. Another maybe reason is weak dissemination or non-targeted dissemination, which means, publishing a report or making a presentation about your research. We do that all the time, but it remains too generic and insufficient sharing with stakeholders, because if you don't target your results, to let's say, give your results to a specific group, there will be no follow-up. They will listen, of course, even there will be some discussion, but then there will be no follow-up. And that is the problem. So what we learn as a lesson is that using evidence for policy making is not automatic. It is something that you have to work on it. And I think it should be also part of any project design from the beginning. When you start doing a research, you plan your research, you need to plan also dissemination and follow-up phase from the beginning. Please, next slide. So for that, could you click? Yeah. There are a few tips that I can already foresee here, but we will hear many more actually through the next presentation, who is our main keynote speaker. But this is from, from my own personal, let's say, experiences over the years in ETF, to increase the importance of evidence and use of evidence in the policymaking. The first one is, as it is lining with the challenges presented, picking up the right issues for research, selecting a research topic that matters to the people, to the policymakers, but also to the daily lives of people whose results can guide for better policies. You need to have a time allocation, as I said, for reflection and follow-up of the results. So it is not that the study should end it as soon as you publish the report. There should be a period where you make the reflection and follow-up for actions. Interpretation and packaging of the results is very important. Normally this, the conclusions and recommendations chapter of any report, nobody reads them, unfortunately, except experts like me, like you. We read them, but if they have to be used by other people, they have to be packaged in a different format, easily understandable format, which is called sometimes skills intelligence, ready to actionable results for people who work in the public administration or in the policy making. Please, next slide. Another good, let's say, tip is that you produce several products from your research. So it's not only one report or one summary of your results for everyone, but rather produce specific products which serve to the interests of ministries for policy making, but also another product which serves to the young people, which can be easily understandable by students, parents who will make the choices, which means that you need to use user-friendly language, but end-user-friendly language. This means that the language you use to explain the results to a minister or to a general director is not the same with the language you use for a student or parent. And that has to be really differentiated in the you don't need to tell everything to the students. You should pick up the things that matter to them from your research. So this is another, let's say, a tip. The next tip is forming alliances from the start by involving them in the analysis, validation, and dissemination together. But this includes not only public institutions or private companies, please do as much as you can do, but also NGOs who work on the topic of your research, or even media or social media, using more effectively the social media. And then also as a result, this is number 6 tip, is that you build a coalition among the institutions, among all these different allies, to reach to the policymakers, let's say, decision makers. Could you please, next slide? I think it's the last one. Another thing is that it never serves to the purpose if you make like 20 recommendations at the end of your study, and which are very generic. Nobody really uses these recommendations because they are too generic, first of all, and they are too many. I mean, it's overwhelming to see 20 recommendations by a decision maker. So you need to trim them down to fewer and simpler actions, which are more feasible to achieve. But at the same time, when you do this prioritization, we need to be aware of trade-offs. You know, when we choose something, there is something else we need to leave out. And what is the impact of choosing one thing over another, or another thing to one thing, this thing? So that has to be thought well in the final product. And initiating policy advocacy I mean, the word advocacy is a bit of, I don't know, it sounds like public relations term, but or communication, but it's more than that. I think it's important to engage in a dialogue to make the decision makers to take ownership of your proposals. And that requires a continuous dialogue and communication and policy advocacy, as it means, with the people. And you need to repeat that. It's not just one-time meeting. It has to involve several meetings to, you know, make an impact on the people. Is there another slide? No. Okay. So all these tips, how can we implement them? It's not easy, but there are already some examples. I think you will hear also from Anastasia on that. But I think organizing regular events for constant exchanges between experts and policymakers is very important. This is not only just a dissemination webinar or validation event. I mean about, you know, structured mechanisms where experts and policymakers meet regularly. That could be creating a structure between politicians and professors, like annual policy forums where university professors meet with local politicians, and the discussions may focus on one theme at a time, so that everything on that theme could be discussed during these policy forums. Also fixing regular research briefings by universities and researchers to the thematic committees in the national parliaments. You know, in the parliaments, there are several committees in every national parliament, one focused on employment, one focused on economy, education, etc. And they are the members of parliaments who make the decisions. So you need to work with them much more often, somehow connect with them. But at the end of the day, there is also one risk. When the evidence produced to be used by the policymakers, there is also a risk that policymakers can pick up the things that serve to their purpose. I mean, evidence, they can use the research to do something else. It is always possible to abuse different, you know, results for different objectives. Therefore, I think researchers have to be extremely careful to make their research available, to make their research methodology and how they reach the conclusion make transparent. Data sources are very clear and transparent. so that you prevent the misuse of research for wrong policy making. Because this also, we have seen some examples in some countries. And the best way to deal with it is making research available to everyone, to the public, including the data sources, methodology you used, etc., so that there is no misinterpretation of the study results by someone who wants to misuse the research. I think I felt the need to say that as well, because it's possible to happen. With that, I stop my intervention, available for any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Muhan. It took me a while to find this unmute button so that I can be back. Dear colleagues, friends, we're waiting for your questions. Please raise your hand or ask questions in the chat if you would like to join this challenging conversation. But while we wait, maybe I can ask one or two questions, and then we'll see how that resonates with others. I like the part on challenges, and I think that there are plenty of those. But I also wonder, what would academicians among ourselves say about incentives to produce policy research that really serves completely different purposes than academic production per se? We all know that academicians, in fact, have different kinds of incentives to publish, to build theories when they're really like in different fields. So I don't know how that resonates with this policy making cycles. That would be the first question. And the second is really about funding, because funding also decides on what kind of evidence is going to be produced and how it is going to be translated into policy action. So these are my questions, not only to Muhan.
Well, you really rack to the bottom of the issues. These are two very important aspects. I would like to hear any other reflection if from others, if you have one, before I answer them, if possible. Just to hear, because I think these are really the most important aspects. I mean, policy-oriented research, different interests of researchers versus interests of politicians or public administrations, plus funding, you know, the topics for of funding. Okay, I guess I need to start my reflection, but please feel free to join me anytime. On the first one, which is different incentives of academics, you know, publishing papers, I think it's an easy fix thing. Depends on how university administration and professors want to be involved on the issues, main issues of faced by the country, by the policymakers. Of course, I don't know, like research in physics is maybe less relevant to the daily life, although I suspect so. Every topic of research has some resonances to our daily lives. And I think the main issue for me, at least for researchers, I think, is to find out how their research connect to the daily life of people, to the society. Even if you are, I don't know, chemical engineer, for example, you do some chemistry research, for example, you need to think about the implications for people, for the nature, for the, I mean, that is, I think, a concern which has to be owned by every researcher. I mean, it is not that research shouldn't be done for the sake of research. It should serve to a purpose at the end of the day. And it is also same with social science. I mean, of course, there are differences between different types of science, social science or natural sciences, but I think connecting your research area with the people's concerns, daily life issues is the number one thing. And this is something it can be done very easily by reorienting university in the university to topics of research, and it can be done by the university administration or by the professors themselves. And you can still make publications. I mean, when you actually choose something more relevant, of course, you will use also, I don't know, the data sources produced by the statistical office, for example. And if you use more statistics produced by the statistical office, actually the part on the other side, the statistical office must be also very happy that their products somehow used for better results, because when nobody used them, there is no meaning of publishing statistics. It's also the change of mentality on the public institutions side that, and then when you have also more access, direct access to this kind of data sources, which is not normally available to all researchers, or not all statistics are accessible, you can make even more publications because there is a common interest here. They can get what can be the policy impact from the policy side, but you can get special access to several data sources to make more publications, as long as there is a kind of some degree of basic trust in between, because I think what is missing in most cases is lack of communication and lack of trust. Once this trust is built, for example, a Ministry of Labor in Serbia can make a kind of long-term 2-year, 5-year agreement with a relatively small budget. It doesn't have to be really high budget, to ask them to make a research in the 4 or 5 economics faculty, for example, on the labor market issues. And all the professors working in the faculty of economics or whatever topic of research is, can be oriented easily, including PhD thesis, It's not that difficult. It's a matter of intention in a way, and matter of trust, mutual trust between different institutions. But I think it's easier to handle it. And coming back to the funding, there is also one area on the funding, one more, let's say, a player in the funding area, which is EU or donors. In the case of our partner countries, of course, funding from the public resources is generally very difficult. But still, every university has its own funding for research. Don't forget about that, starting with the research funding. On top of that, there are funding coming from private sector or associations, which can be also, promoted, advocated to get. The same with the NGOs, but the most important is the donors. There, I think researchers has also something to say. I think it is also your task to mention what matters to your country for researching. What are the main topics? Generally, donors come to the country with the idea that they need to understand the situation better. Normally, there are not many decided issues. Okay, the issue could be labor market. They want to know labor market better. that comes predetermined, but how you focus them is mostly up to the experts at the end of the day. You have much more maneuver than you think, in my opinion. It's just a matter of being more conscious and reorient yourself to the topics. Of course, there is always the issue, the infamous issue is, for example, tobacco companies funding on the benefits of smoking during the 50s and 60s. I remember this thing from the US. There was several research how smoking can be useful, can open up your breathing, etc., funded by the tobacco companies. There is always misuse of these things, of course, but that goes down to the ethical behavior of researchers. I mean, we cannot really change everybody, but I think that's also part of the work ethics. But it is less. I mean, it's not that common to have this thing. I mean, it's just a matter of your principles. I see someone shared something. Ivan, would you like to talk?
Ivan? We see you talking, but maybe you should unmute. Yeah.
No, I was trying to say something and it went too early. No, I mean, since you asked me, I have a reflection. I'm sharing a paper and a webinar that we did a couple of years ago, 5 years ago already, I think, on the research policy nexus and reflecting on many of the issues you are just discussing. And my take, I agree on the first issue, on the issue mainly of how to have an impact on how to build this trust. I think that researchers tend to have a complex of superiority because they think they have the knowledge. And I'm a researcher. I have never been policymaker, just to be clear. And they tend to think that policymakers first, that they don't read, which is not exactly true. And try to introduce something wrong in any of your papers, and you will see how people read. I mean, so it is, they don't read what they are not interested in, of course. And they read maybe in a different way that researchers read, but they do read what is published. And second, I mean, it is not that they are not interested in the research questions, it's that they have a different agenda and different objectives. And if we don't align with their objectives, at least in our recommendations, there is no way they are going to have any interest in our production. Because, I mean, you like it or not, it is not only about the impact on the population, on employment, on poverty, on skills and human capital. It is also mainly about understanding that policy making is politics as well, and policy making is also performative. And this gives us a very good opportunity to insert all results into the policy making process. I mean, very often policymakers look for research supporting their positions, and this is very legitimate. This is a way of using research, and for me, this is the best way to try to have a real impact. But sorry, I'm going to send the paper now properly. You took me by surprise, Umuhan.
That is how we operate here. Thank you,
okay.
Ivan, for your reflection, and thank you, Umuhan, actually for very concrete and implementational steps, because what I picked up from this conversation is that we can have ethical guidelines within certain government offices being operational and providing oversight when it comes to research. You've been mentioning also think tank function of governments. This is not news to some countries, but to many it is. And securing some small funding that is like medium term, with medium-term objectives can help moving on or setting the agenda. I also like very much Ivan's contribution. It brings us back to politics and policies. We are running out of time when it comes to this part of the session. Now I'm handing over to Began Chiazu, my colleague, who will be facilitating the second part of this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Branka. I think I will need another extra 10, 12 minutes for my next presenter. So I'm Began Chiazov. I'm a regional facilitator for Central Asia. Our next speaker is Anastasia Delikouri, policy analyst, Joint Research Center from European Commission. She will be presenting two frameworks. I think we already have shared that attaching to our agenda. So she will be unpacking those frameworks. Those are competence framework for science, for policy, for researchers, and competency framework for innovative policy making. As Ivan said, the policy making it's more political thing. So Anastasia has also a political science background. Maybe she will also expand that part as well. And also to make more interactive, our next session, I request you to comment. If you are a researcher, please type R. If you are a policymaker, please type P. And also from where you are joining, which country. So we can shape our Q&A session based on countries because our following sessions will be on country cases. We will be happy to make our Q&A session more relevant. So thank you so much in advance for your participation. And Anastasia, please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Bengens, for the introduction. And thank you, Umuhan, for setting already the ground of what I'm going to talk about today. So there already have been some insights on how this landscape in connecting evidence to policy making works, or it doesn't work, or which are the kind of facilitators in this interaction, or the kind of barriers that might hinder this interaction. So in my talk today, I will try to analyze some of these factors, but also focus on capacity building, because it might feel like it's a straightforward approach and a procedure that, of course, is common sense and everybody can really be engaged in that, but it's not the case. So it takes a number of skills, it takes a number of different attitudes also on both sides to maintain this bridge between scientists and policymakers. I'm Anastasia Delgiori from the Joint Research Center, and for the people that are not really familiar with the Joint Research Center, the Joint Research Center is a science and knowledge service of the European Commission. So we're not the policymakers, we're the ones that try to provide evidence to the European Commission throughout the policy cycle. And we work in a kind of reactive way. So whenever there is a policy, we are trying to understand which are the relevant scientific input for specific policy options, but we also try to be proactive. So try to identify the challenges that come ahead and try to prepare, have the relevant science already on the table to the best possible extent, and be prepared also to identify relevant other challenges. In that sense, we are also the ones that try to bridge and make sense of the abundance of knowledge, because it's not only us producing science. Of course, science does not have any borders. We collaborate with universities, research centers. We try to collect the relevant, peer-reviewed, high-quality scientific input before we try to actually craft messages and outputs that are policy relevant. Because as mentioned before, having a 500 pages report does not really help in really making an impact. The report has to be there, of course, but you also need to have a more tangible output. Next slide, please, because that's the only introduction. I thought of going a bit into the concept, which is not, again, comes as straightforward how it works and what it is. I won't, of course, keep you very busy with conceptual issues, but just to ensure we have a kind of common language. Next slide, please. So the main narrative is science for policy, but the umbrella, the more inclusive term is evidence-informed policy making, and it's more accurate than evidence-based policy. Why? Because evidence, it's only one of the factors that informs policy making, right? It's not a technocratic process. So like you have a paper on the desk, and that means this is the most critical factor in deciding what the policy option would be. Of course, scientific evidence constitutes the backbone of what we call evidence, because evidence is also citizens' consultations. Evidence might be administrative data, experts' opinion, so might be a different set of things. Of course, scientific evidence and how you actually do the hierarchy is very important. It's not the same. But we also need to understand that on the policymaker's desk, there are also other types of evidence that they need to take into account. For example, the social impact, economic impact. These are policies that are decided. They're not papers that have an impact of people. So you need to assess all these things, even if you have the best possible scientific evidence. That's why it's evidence-informed. So that's part of it, and not evidence-based policy, the term that I think more accurately grasps this essence of translating evidence to policy making. The idea is, of course, that the better informed the policymakers are, and the more aware they are of the different types of evidence, but also like where is the strongest evidence towards a policy option, the better decisions they can make. And that, of course, having evidence increases the quality of the whole process of legislative process, a policy-making process, and also allows policymakers to have a full picture of all the different options and why this option might be, prioritized over something else. As I said, it's not a technical issue. So the importance of having evidence does not really come only because that's the usually mainstream approach when you have identified a problem and you're looking on which are the relevant scientific studies, right, that can help you navigate in this complexity and understand the possible, let's say, policy solutions. It comes when you try actually to frame the problem per se, right? So you need to have evidence to understand the problem rather than at the second stage try to see what is the way forward. I'm not saying that there it's not relevant. I'm just saying that it's very critical when you try to understand the problem, because usually nowadays we have problems that are very complex, that have many layers in the different, let's say, regions that have really resulted to this problem. They have a kind of interaction. So one problem is rarely touching only upon one policy area. It's usually affecting or has effects in other policy areas. So that's what Umhan already mentioned about the silos. Sometimes policymakers think in their silos. Researchers do that as well. But the social problems are much broader, and you need to understand the big picture. Next slide, please. So there's a shift in context also, like not only after COVID, but because of this unfortunately polycrisis model, that we need also like to ensure that evidence makes it on a timely manner to policy making, because we know that the timelines between researchers and policymakers are not aligned. So it doesn't really help if you can provide to a policymaker something after they have decided, or like 2 years later on. So it has to be a kind of institutionalization of the whole process that really is respective of both timelines and tries to find, let's say, a ground where these two different timelines can work. And of course, that many unprecedented challenges, and the fact that we need to have a systematic collection of evidence to do that. So it can't be an ad hoc procedure that we reach out whenever we really have the need, and we don't really know when we need that. It has to be an established process. And there has been quite a growing interest in the member states, and also a commitment of the Council of the EU in informing science, informing policymaking with scientific input. Next slide, please. So, but I have also to underline, and also came, I think, as a kind of hint from the discussion previously, that not any evidence should be useful for policymakers. So you should be aware where the evidence comes from, where it's high quality, where it's peer reviewed, where it's really representative. So you might have a survey of 50 people per country. It's not really representative of the country, but also not in any way. So it has to comply with some principles to ensure that we are avoiding any dangers of how you use evidence in policymaking, because it's still a policymaking process. We have to understand that. So it has to be the relevant evidence. Sometimes it's difficult for researchers to understand that whatever is relevant to policymakers, not perhaps the full length and the full breadth of the work they're doing, but has to tackle the problem they're trying to see. It's important to understand and have an openness from policymakers which evidence they use, for people to be able to access it and understand why this policy has been prioritized over something else. And also like to make sure that this also complies to democratic values, right? So like how people feel about these policies, whether they are involved from the beginning of the process, whether this really, whatever policy is decided, is really compliant with democratic values and so on and so forth. And it's important also like to understand that we are, of course, speaking about the societies that have also conflicting interests, conflicting values. You need to be aware of this process. You need to be aware of the debate. You need to have an open deliberation and understand all these different values and interests that can contribute to the whole process, and which one of them is actually prevailing. Next slide, please. So, as I said, I mean, sometimes it's seen that it's scientists and policymakers. These are the actors in this evidence-informed policymaking, let's say, ecosystem. But that's, again, policies decided for people. So engaging with people and stakeholders, understanding their views, understanding their diverse perspectives, it's an important, and not exercise, a requirement that you have to do in evidence-informed policymaking. And also, it can also show you, but of course, nobody is expert on everything, and you're not asking ex-citizens to be expert on everything, but they can provide their, let's say, situational knowledge and how they understand these policies, because they may have also relevant experiences. And that sometimes shows us also by bringing different and diverse perspectives that are things that we haven't thought that we don't know. So sometimes, as we said, we don't know what we don't know. So you have to be open and you have to be reflective in this process. And you have to do, as we say, learn and unlearn, be able to also like reflect on your own views. Next slide, please. So again, I would like to highlight here that evidence does not come only when you are, let's say, in the process of policy formulation. So you do have a problem, that's the way it's framed, and we're looking on the scientific evidence to see which is the way forward and how the new policy was going to be crafted. The most important stage of the so-called policy cycle, which is of course a model, right, comes in the agenda setting and how you frame a problem. I'm not saying that evidence is not important in all the other stages, it's equally important, but that's the critical stage, because the way you form a problem will actually define what kind of evidence you will be looking for. So, and we know that is also a values perspective actually integrated in that. So in the agenda setting, how you said, could you please click, because there are different things coming on the screen. Okay, when you try to identify priorities in the policy formulation to understand the policy challenge, implementation to see how implementation can really be more efficient and respective of citizens' needs. And of course, in the end, because it's always an ongoing cycle, how you understand the effects, the impact, and whether this policy has really been working well, so you can inform the next cycle. Next slide, please. So I will try to show now what the work we have been doing, but of course in a very condensed way. I'm not sure I will do that justice to all the work we're doing, but feel free to reach out to us later on. So next slide, please, on how we work on science for policy. Again, that's a visual that I've tried to explain to you in the beginning of the presentation on what the JRC is actually doing as a knowledge and science hub of the European Commission. Has two strands of working. of work. Like the first one is, again, collecting the evidence of knowledge and understanding the complexity. And that's why we also work in the so-called portfolios, where they bring projects from different, let's say, disciplines on working on a particular topic. Let's say environment, let's say health. But it's not only health specialists. It has to be also, let's say, social scientists. So we bring this kind of diversity and interdisciplinary way of bringing science together. That's the kind of connecting the dots, if I may say so, and also ensuring that all the different perspectives and disciplines are really heard. But the most important part is like what you see in the middle of your screen, that the knowledge management, how you make sense of it, how do you distill that kind of knowledge, how you also like understand the quality of evidence and what the evidence really means, and then how you do actually feed what you see on your right hand of your screen, the policy making. It's not the box, but like different interactions taking place. And that's a difficult process that we're working on every day. It has to be a continuous one. It is. In the Commission, there are established processes, but still it's a process that has to be actually very focused and ensure that you made a huge and a very dedicated effort in reaching out to policymakers early, but also when they are asking for your support in terms of reaching out to the relevant evidence and understanding it. Next slide, please. And this is how we work again. The mission of JRC, you can see there on the left side of your screen, and I will focus on the last words. So the Joint Research Centre provides independent evidence-based knowledge and science supporting EU policies to positively impact society. I'm just underlining that because usually the narrative on either science for policy or evidence-informed policy making has a strong, let's say, focus on policy making. Yes, but that's not the end of the process. Policy making is important because it makes decisions for people. So the idea is not to support policy making per se. These are the means to ensure that decisions that are made are really having a positive impact on societies. And that's how we work throughout the policy cycle. And the next slide will show you in more, let's say, practical, tangible way, which kind of inputs we provide throughout the policy cycle. Next slide, please. So that's throughout the policy cycle, the EU policy cycle, how we work. We have, as I said, early in the process, engaging researchers is very important. We have strong foresight teams, and they have published amazing reports on megatrends, horizon scanning, all the different tools on identifying the future challenges, but of course we have to work with the present as well. So we try to see what are the critical issues and provide our input, for example, in how the priorities will work. Because everything also in policymaking is a matter of priorities. You may need to address 10 problems, but you have to understand which is the most urgent one. And then of course, there's an issue of different perspectives. As you know, the EU involves many member states, 27, the different interests and the different deliberations taking place. But also, like in the policy design, JRC tries to support the whole process by providing science for impact assessment. So all legislative proposals of the Commission, most of them at least, they are accompanied by impact assessment. They are fully accessible online. And citizen engagement tools. There's the Have Your Say platform that you can provide your input. In the Commission, we are called and sometimes in meetings in inter-service groups with policy director generals. And of course, in the end of the whole policy making cycle, we provide quality assurance tools, methods, and technical guidance and models on how to assess and evaluate policy. So we try to operate throughout the policy cycle, trying to bring scientific evidence and scientific tools to support the policy-making process, but also like to acknowledge difficulties, risks, uncertainties. In this process of science for policy, it's important to be very clear and sincere with the uncertainties, right? So it's not easy to have all the scientific evidence you would have wished to have at the stage that you're trying to decide. But you have to be clear from the scientific perspective that this is the kind of evidence we have, that's the level of uncertainty involved in that, and that's the level of risk as well. Also, of course, for policymakers, that's the same thing, right? So when they communicate their policies, they need to also to explain the level of uncertainty involved in that. Next slide, please, because I'm not sure about the time. Okay, I think I have some time. And that comes from the better regulation. I won't go through the better regulation in depth, but that's the framework, the regulatory framework of the European Commission, and would actually implement all the things I've been telling you about. So evidence-informed policymaking is not a theory. It's not just a nice framework, a nice to have. It is the way the Commission works throughout the policy cycle, and that's the toolbox that shows how evidence should work throughout the different stages. But I think that's something you can also take a look later on. So from the understanding, mapping, collecting, analyzing, and then presenting. Also, how you present evidence might be a very critical part, because sometimes you have only 5 minutes to explain what is the potential added value of your work. And sometimes this is the part that researchers really are not well trained to do it, or we are talking in a way that is not really comprehensible for policymakers. I know, because I'm coming from academia for 20 years, so I know it's very difficult to ensure that, I don't know, like an edited volume that you spend 2 years, it's really being translated to an easy, digestible kind of message in 2 minutes. That's a very difficult exercise. Next slide, please. And then we have worked in our unit, which is a unit that works in a horizontal way. So we are not working on specific policies, more we're doing work in terms of democracy, misinformation, technological challenges, and so on and so forth. We have tried to understand how this interaction can really work. Because again, it doesn't come as a natural skill for scientists, which are trained in a very different way. It doesn't come also naturally to policymakers, although there has been, I think, a huge improvement on their understanding for the need to have scientific evidence, and the new generation of policymakers is also quite well educated in understanding that. So we try to understand which are the competencies and skills that are important in order to map all the different competencies and skill set, and ensure that this kind of interaction is really productive. Because again, having scientists and policymakers in the same room, it doesn't mean that there has been really any productive interaction. So we have developed, next slide please, 2 competence frameworks, one for scientists to work on science for policy, and you can see here the 5 different clusters on how, and that they are split in different sets of competencies, as you can see that. And just to say from the outset that there's a full publication about that. I only have 2 minutes to explain it, but you can access it freely online, as you can do with all our publications. So that's the competence framework for researchers, how they understand policy, how they can really work in the knowledge brokering actions that is mentioned already, how they need to collaborate and develop this mindset, engage with stakeholders, and have a communication mindset. And you can, see how that is split in different competencies and skills. Next slide, please. But similarly, it's not only for scientists to ensure that they do have these skills and the kind of mindset to engage. It's very important that the other side, policymakers, are willing to listen, are willing to engage in this process. So we're trying also to build capacity to policymakers. And this is the framework for policymakers that you can see there are more clusters, right? That's more demanding because it doesn't come naturally that they work with evidence. The third cluster on working with evidence is the one which is more focused on evidence-informed policymaking, but these are actually cross-cutting skills that are relevant throughout the policy cycle. So you can see that also, like perhaps you cannot see because you don't have the time, but there are 3 classes that are common in terms of collaboration, communication, and engagement, because this competence framework are also aimed to work in a complementary way, right? So they have to fit to each other. And also the news is that we are also trying to work on a competence framework for people that sit and really operate in what we say in between. The kind of intermediaries, the knowledge brokers, the people that actually do this translation. Because for scientists, it doesn't come, that's their main job. For policymakers, they might also need somebody to support this process. So we're trying to develop now a competence framework for knowledge brokers. So the people that have the main job, because actually it's a full-time job, to ensure that these interactions are taking place, they are productive, and they really can have an impact. Next slide, please. And what we've said, so we have the theoretical framework, the models, the competence framework. There is the whole concept on how you work with that in the commission. But there are also trainings based on these competence frameworks that we deliver to scientists and also to policymakers. But also we are working with the member states on implementing this kind of approaches and supporting them in building capacity on evidence-informed policymaking. Next slide, please. So we have identified that from single elements that might be scattered let's say in a country, we need to see the whole framework, what we call ecosystem, actors, institutions, procedures, and principles too, because if it's like a fragmented ecosystem, it doesn't really work, or it has many gaps that cannot be fulfilled in a way that is really effective. And try to understand all these different national ecosystems because they are different, right? And how this ecosystems build a European one, because in the end, evidence flows around the countries, and you don't really need to reinvent the wheel if there's something already there. So the idea is also to facilitate an access, but also like a peer learning process, so countries can learn from each other as well. Next slide, please. And we have worked with a technical support instrument project, which is a project that is funded by SecGen Reform, the Director General of the Commission. It's upon demand, so countries apply for support. That was a project run from 2022 to 2025 with the countries that you see at the bottom. So it was Belgium, Netherlands, it was Greece, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. We have worked in developing or either developing, because some countries didn't have it, or supporting their existing ecosystem to grow and to be sustainable with regard to science advice. So are there any institutions, are there researchers working on that? Are there established procedures, how we can improve them? We have worked with the countries, with their beneficiaries, which were other centers of government, so the policymaking side, but also researchers, in bringing about a roadmap that is informed from their own perspective, so not a top-down process, but a process that has been a co-creation. Similarly, next slide, please. We're now working on another project more focused on the twin, so green and digital transition, with another 7 countries. So this consortium is led by Spain. So it's Spain, it's Portugal, it's Ireland, it's Austria, France, Poland, and Cyprus. So a very diverse landscape of countries. And again, this is the kind of project follow-up, but has a more learning and development angle, because we have identified that that's actually the pillar upon which you build any kind of capacity. If you don't have this pillar developed, then you cannot have a long-term perspective. Next slide, please, which I think is the last one. So that's the few remarks and the things that we've learned. So we may have sometimes nice models, right? So we may have, let's say, common, let's say, good practices, but context matters. So it's important to understand the factors. It's important to understand how things operate in a country and adjust to the country needs, right? So there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Of course, best practices are very much appreciated, and countries really appreciate the peer learning process, but each country, it has its own profile, and that's very respected, of course. And that's also the wealth of the whole project, that every country is different and it brings another mindset. And there are different ways also, like on working with evidence in different policy areas. So you have the Ministry of Health understands evidence in a quite different way, and the hierarchy is different. When you speak, for example, with the Ministry of Social Affairs, might have another mindset. So you also need to understand that evidence does not come in a way which is a linear way. It really also varies across different policy areas. And that's also pertinent to how scientists think in different policy areas as well, and research areas. So I guess most of the researchers that are joining in this webinar, and they have been in a consortium where they had to collaborate with different colleagues. So each discipline has its own mindset. setting a common ground with a common language and understanding of what evidence-informed policymaking is important. It might seem like a minor factor. It's not. It's not to be taken for granted that everybody understands this framework in the same way. And we also need to avoid misunderstandings and misuse of this framework. How the institutional setup supports or not supports policy making informed by evidence is important. So if there are established procedures, it really works much better. If it's an ad hoc, yes, the approach that it might be useful or not, it won't really help. And developing the minds and the skills, as I said, is really important because that's the beginnings and the trust, of course. But on the other hand, it has to be a political support. So it has to be a process that the policymakers really believe in, right? So they can really engage with. And I think that's the last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, right. So I will provide you there all the things. So these are the reports for each country. You can read the final report of the project, the reflection paper, conference materials, all these kind of things. And then we provide the resources and the links to all the things that I have discussed and all the publications you can reach out freely and download. And I hope I have condensed everything in the time that I was expecting to have, and I haven't exceeded my time. Or Bengage was very kind with me and he hasn't interrupted me. I don't know. But I'll stop here anyway. Thanks a lot for your attention. And feel free to reach out to us with your ideas, reflections, questions, or because I think that the time of a webinar, of course, is limited. Thanks a lot.
Again, we cannot hear you.
Perfect. Now I think you can hear me. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It's really informative, and it was more than I know. In Florence, you also share some practical tools. Now we learn much more on top of that. I wonder, your Joint Research Center is providing policy guidance or policy support for the EU member states, but the ETF partners countries are also coming from different neighboring countries. Is there any non-European successful case of using these frameworks? That's the first question. I also invite Umbehan if she can ask her question by joining, or I can read the question. Yeah.
Of course, yes, our focus, of course, by definition, is the member states. But we have been delivering trainings and talks also beyond. So try to engage with the community further. But I cannot provide you any kind of example from further from the EU because our work is focused on the member states. But I think what we're developing in terms of theoretical work, but also studies, because the studies that JRC is doing is not necessarily focused on the member states. We try to see, for example, in water management issues, the broader perspective. That you can find, I think, very important insights on how evidence can work in different areas, not necessarily countries, but areas or topics. But that's we are over 2,000 researchers residing in 6 cities over 5 countries. So for colleagues that would like to engage on the particular topic, there are different clusters of work that you can see relevant work and how it has or not has informed relevant initiatives at the local level.
So we are receiving questions from the chat. So Umhan has a question about the setting the agenda. Who is setting the agenda? Politicians, media, researcher, or people, and how can we deal with misinformation? And follow up to that, what is the role of artificial intelligence in shaping agenda and problem definition, research, and evidence creation, and how we can deal with it in general? It's, I think, very relevant to our current time.
Yeah. Thanks, Umuhan, for the question. I think it's a full webinar, if not 2, yes, to respond to these questions, but just some highlights from my own perspective. Again, not necessarily presenting the JRC perspective. But like the JRC, of course, is contributing scientific evidence, right? It's a whole policy cycle, and it's a multi-layered process in the European Union that makes decisions also informed by different institutions, right? Of course, this process has values, has priorities that we need to acknowledge that. That's why I've said it's a evidence-informed policymaking process. But I think science can really enrich the debate, also clarify things, provide the best picture of reality, what it's there. And that can also and ensure that we can tackle in that sense misinformation and disinformation. Because when you have the evidence and the data on the table of the debate, things are more clear on which are the options and which options were preferred and why. Because that is an important process that can also help citizens understand why policies are not. Of course, there's always going to be debates. There's always going to be disagreements. There's also, this process is also value-laden, but also values that are integrated in the European texts and treaties. So that's the ones we work on. I think the role of scientists in this complexity of interactions is very important in setting the ground for a healthy debate. Of course, there are going to be different approaches because there are also different approaches between scientists. It's not that always science comes with one voice to a problem, but you need to understand what kind of evidence supports the option A, option B, or option D. So you have to understand that. In terms of artificial intelligence, I think it's a game changer for sure. And we do not know yet how will that affect the whole landscape of evidence-informed policy making. All I can say is that you need to have rules on that, and you need to maintain the human oversight. That's also what the AI Act of the EU says, and to really understand the limits of it, right? And where the fact that everything has to be managed, has to be supervised by humans, which are always the ones that make decisions, not AI.
So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand or just simply you can join. I also want to read another question, which is from Ummehan. It's about the policymakers and their values and their interest. Then, for example, in terms of agenda setting and policy formulation. So the question is, how can researchers influence and or provide inputs into those steps of agenda setting and policy formulation of policies?
Yes, you have to be clear on the values, and you have to be clear on both sides, I have to say, because of course scientific methods try to minimize any kind of personal reflections on the evidence, but also how you frame a question is important, or whether you have followed this specific framework or the other may also affect your work. So scientists have to be clear on that, but also policymakers have to be clear. There might be a conflict of values. It's something that happens in societies. Of course, not everybody agrees with everything, but I think science can help us understand what are the different options, right? And what are the values ingrained in its option. And of course, what I said, respect the democratic values, because you may have options that do not really respect them. And scientists can also are able to reveal the evidence behind it, because sometimes, unfortunately, in this evidence-informed policymaking, but also in general in societies nowadays, also with the role of media and the social media, whatever, it's difficult to disentangle between facts and opinions. So that's something that science can also help in ensuring that this is the fact and this is the opinion. And also scientists, when they come to the dialogue, they also have to be honest that this is what science says, but my opinion is that. But that has to be two different things, right? Because scientists develop research, but sometimes their hypothesis is not really verified. And that's something that happens in research. That's fine. Yes, that's why we do research, because we don't know what's going to be the outcome. So again, from our side, we're not the ones who decide, right? Scientists are not to decide, are to provide the different options, but they have to be, as we say, honest brokers. So provide all the different options of the table. This is the evidence. This is a strong evidence. So I highlight that because it's not always easy for policymakers to understand. Highlight, for example, when there's a research that comes from a specific interest. So it's funded by X, Y, Z, I don't know. So that's also important for policymakers to understand the source of evidence that reaches their table, the conflict, but also scientists understand the different stakeholders in the table and what they bring. So also be open-minded and listen. I think it's for them to clarify the debate, if I may say so, and put it on a healthy, let's say, standard. It's not for them to decide, unless, of course, you have 90% of the evidence says that in the last 20 years. So probably that's the strongest evidence you can have. It's difficult to underestimate. But then it's a process of policy making, right? There are all things that interfere in the whole process. You need to be aware of that as well.
I have a personal question. I think that's also might be interesting for all of us here. Branka, I need 1 more minute to get there because Anastasia is here. I just wanted to ask the question. So we are talking about researchers and policymakers, and it's easy to see when the article is missing those recommendations for policymakers. We can simply check in the end of the article or any scientific output, but I don't think policy can be made without any scientific evidence. So how we can detect that policy is lacking evidence in it? How that can be assessed?
Yeah, that's not easy also to see the impact, right? To take it from the start. Sometimes it's not clear whether there was an impact, and impact can be translated in different things. So impact can be like, for example, let's say in JRC that the work we have done appears in the impact assessment. So in taking into consideration the, let's say the different policy options, that was the strongest because there was the strongest evidence, and you can clearly see that. But it might be an impact as well that you cannot really trace. So it has changed the mindset from the beginning. That's not really somewhere you can detect on the text, but you know that there was another option, and because of scientific evidence, that there's another option now that is more preferable. How you can, that's if I can respond to your question, Begans, it's that's why I speak about procedures. So to ensure that there has been policies that were informed, not necessarily based 100% on science. There has to be a process. Has that process taken place? Is there something established, or they need to reach for evidence before they decide? Because if it's, again, an ad hoc procedure, a very subjective one, that the ex-politician or policymaker looks for evidence or not, then of course it's not easy or clear. But also transparency is very important. How the process has been initiated, which were the stakeholders involved, how the discussions have taken. It's not a process that has to be, let's say, you have to assume it happened. It has to be established. And that also allows the process not to derail, to be as much as possible on track. As much as possible, again, it's a policy-making process. I will underline that again. It's not that you can put everything on a line and ensure that everything works like ticking boxes. Again, ticking boxes might be also not the case, because we don't want the process to just tick boxes. We want to be substantial. Yes.
We really need to move forward, but Ivan also wants to join. Please, then yes, we can move forward. Yeah.
Very, very briefly. I mean, and something that has not been highlighted so far is that research is not omniscient. Research is very often wrong, and it can be the wrong research can be used to do wrong policies, and we don't even have real evidence that research based or research informed policy is better than non informed or research informed policies. I mean, this is a normative approach. I very much advocate for it, but it is a value charge approach. I don't think we have huge evidence. And I will give a very quick example. Spain has increased the minimum wage over the last 60 years in more than 60%. All research said this was destructive for the labor market and it would destroy a lot of employment. Exactly the contrary has happened. And now, of course, researchers are very quickly catching up on their own conclusions. So we have to be modest as well. This is my only point.
Yeah, of course, it's not that science will resolve all the problems. And you need to be aware, again, of all the different factors, right? So having the perfect science on the table does not mean that this is also implemented, because it may affect humans' life in a very different way. You have to take into account that, because that's, again, a policy-making process. It's not a paper that's going to be reviewed and then you may have another paper, then it's fine. That's a whole different process. But having having evidence on the table really helps you understand what is the case. You cannot foresee everything because also societies change, but I think that's an important factor that can help you really have a better picture of how society works. Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anastasia. It would be nice if you can stay till the end of the webinar so we can have final insights. Branka, it's your turn. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Very intriguing conversation, and some of the questions will actually be asked to Ruben to respond. Ruben, it's a great pleasure to introduce you once again to the audience that don't know you. Ruben Sargassian is the director of the National Institute of Labor and Social Research of the Republic of Armenia. Just until recently, actually, he served as a deputy minister of Labor and Social Affairs, where he was engaged and led major labor market and employment policy reforms in the country. I won't list what you have done in your professional career because it will take me some time. But given your perspective, I would like to ask you to reflect on how in Armenia you bridge evidence and policy. So what really worked and what didn't? Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Really, it was very interesting to hear colleagues' their presentation because this gave me the time to reflect the way that path through. And so let me first of all introduce my material that I prepared today. I took two initiatives and hope it will be interesting as a lesson to learn, because sometimes when you're sharing your experiences, it's not to say how is good, it's how to say how not to do. But because every time in the political, when you're making political decision, it's time. You need less time, and sometimes you're reading a lot of presentations, researches, reports, but short time you should make decision, and some reports lose not presenting reality what's going on, just opinion the expert. But before that, we're talking, I think during the answer the question, I will open more about that. Let me introduce our experiences in my country, which on two levels, strategic level and operational levels, how research and evidence translated into the policy in practice. So, well, let's go to the next slide, please. And certainly, it's nothing new. In every country, we have such problem, like gap between data availability and its actual use in policy making. The main question is how do they do? Data exists labor force survey, as you saw there. I see the administrative data, macroeconomic indicator, but the challenge has been how to translate this evidence into correct policy decision. Our experiences show that this translation is not automatic. It's required institutional process and political commitment, and it's not so easily to pass that. So, and one of the samples that I want to introduce, this next slide, that now, as I see, the not last one presentation, but please go to the next slide. Next. Okay. Let's stop on strategy that we developed approximately 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. And why I want to introduce you this, we put two tracks, parallel tracks. One of them is the data analysis using labor force survey data over the multiple years and macroeconomic indicators and international experiences. The second one is designing based on the analysis and conclusions of the surveys, including identifying priorities, costing, and integrating stakeholders' feedbacks. So please, next slide. So as you see, wide range of stakeholders were involved in this process, including government institutions, business representatives, trade unions, and international partners as the World Bank, International Labour Organization, and ETF certainly, and IMF, which expertise gives us a lot of information. And critical turning point was the evaluation of existing employment programs. Please go back one of the slides before. Next, else again, one more, this one. So, well, this is a critical point, how and why we decide and what decision we come. As I mentioned, the critical point was the evaluation of existing employment programs, which revealed low effectiveness. 10% effectiveness is so one of the less effectiveness that I saw anywhere. Based on this, the government decision strengthening the role evidence in employment policy. So, as you see here, as a result, strategy defined target groups and policy direction grounded the analysis and that I showed before. So, I want to introduce one sample on the level ILMP, Active Labor Market Project. Please, next slide. Next one, the next one, and this one. So, this is this project we designed it during crisis as a crisis response project. It's most one of the difficult time and period for us. We have a lot of refugees, and so we try to solve their problems. And this program not is designed isolated. It's coming from the strategy and serve it as a pilot for its implementation. At the same time, context rapid decision making evidence was not fully available in that time. So we're using, let me see, where is it? A few sources: demographic data, displaced person, labor market, and tax administration data, dedicated labor force survey, which conducted among displaced person, and direct consultation with beneficiary. As a result, we designed this program, and certainly this allowed us to design targeted measure and adapt them over the time monitoring. And we implement certainly during the first period monitoring to understanding how it's implemented, how it's effective. So during the implementation, that project now is continuing the LMP. Certainly we making some adjustments based on the feedback, based on the monitoring. So maybe go to the next slide. The next one. So I'd like to introduce a policy feedback loop that we did and use it, because sometimes some people think that if you develop strategy, it's enough, that's all. But in practice, it's not so. And our experiences show that it's like the process which always continuing and never stopping. It could be stopped. And the strategy informed look like this loop that I want to introduce to you. The strategy informing the program design, the program generating new evidence through the implementation and monitoring, as I mentioned before, and evidence was then used to refine both program and elements of the strategy. In other words, that I want to say is by this slide, the policy was not only based on evidence, it's also produces its self-evidence. And let me go into other one slide. Okay. So, about success factors, several factors made it possible. First, political decision to rely more on evidence following the evaluation of existing policies, as you saw here. Second one, the combination of structured analysis and continuous stakeholders engagement. And third one, the use real programs as a testing mechanism for policy ideas. And I don't introduce here, but we, in the same time, implemented another one project, which allowed us to define our strategy. It's calling result-based financing active labor market program, which give us opportunity to adjust again our strategy, one of the components of our strategy. So if you saw again, importantly, success did not come from pre-existing system, but it combined these elements from practice. And we're talking about challenges. There are a lot of, but I've put off free one. Absence of full integrated data systems. In every country, they have such problem. I think the time required to develop strategy, because sometimes when you design strategy, it took too much time, but life is going on and a lot of change. And that's the same period. And the worst thing is crisis situation to make decision. And sometimes, in many cases, not sometimes, decision had to taken with incomplete evidence. And coming to conclusion, please, next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Based on our experience, that evidence-based policymaking is not linear process. It's iterative. Strategy inform action, action generate evidence, and evidence defines policy. Certainly, in this case, policy is not only based on evidence, it's also produced it, as I mentioned before. So when we come in the last one, where I wrote just a thank you, it's the same idea that I always mentioned, and we look at the small line between all decisions. That means policy is not linear process. And if shortly, I want to introduce in small time, though certainly I have a lot of experiences in that, and our case more, a lot of what I want to introduce, but it's lack of time, and maybe I will answer based on open that process based on the questions. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Ruben. I think that the floor is open for questions. So again, you can ask them in the chat or you can raise hand, but let me go back to the conversation that we already started with the previous presenter, and this is about impact of the policies that government bodies create. So my question to you is how you decide what policy has been effective and was successful when it comes to the implementation, and which policy actually failed. So do you have any pack that provides certain steps on evaluating what worked, what didn't? Can you just elaborate a bit more on this topic?
Thank you. So, as I mentioned during the implementation pilot models that we're using, that we wrote in strategy, put in our draft strategy, we conducted monitoring. We have some indicators. If we're talking about employment, so certainly we put indicators, employment rate, how long time they stay in labor market or employed. And we saw that that measures that they put in these projects not work and not giving us the results we were expecting before. We have approximately 5 programs we are stopped during the implementation because the results of monitoring shows that they're not effective. As I mentioned, the effectiveness for us, any coins of government budget, any coins of social budget globally, spending on employment must give results. Sometimes it's short-term results. Short-term results for employment 6 months or 1 year. it shows that the person who passing through that projects are employed or not, or how much money we earn. That meaning, are the measures, are the ideas that put in that project reach their goals or not? Because main goals for us, the person find his job. If you're talking certainly about employment projects, certainly I'm not talking about the global policy changes. Their measures are different, and sometimes they need a long time for answer the question: are they effective or not? So I think I don't forget nothing to answer. I hope so.
Well, it's a hard question, because I'm thinking, is it really about a design of certain policy that was based on wrong premise, or it is really about the implementation failures that can be related to many factors during the implementation? But I guess this question requires a lot of time for elaboration. So I'm asking others to continue this conversation that we have had and that we are having. So any more thoughts about implementation challenges and whether it is due to the implementation per se, or it is really actually related to poor design and maybe not so well fed evidence that we are talking about today?
Can I?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mukhan.
Well, personally, I was for a while working for the Ministry of Labor. So I was also on the kind of policymaking side in my young times. And what I observed that actually the best policies designed on the paper, I saw them how they failed tremendously from the implementation. I mean, it is having a very good, excellent strategy is something, but getting a good expected result from that excellent strategy is something else. There are many factors which affects the success of the policies. And I don't think having a good strategy is it is necessary precondition, but it is not enough to have the successful results. That is my experience, at least. So implementation matters a lot, how the policy is implemented in practice, which means that you need very good public administration at the end of the day. I mean, quality human resources, let's put it that way. Without human resources, I mean, human capital, everything is much more difficult. That's why also the quality of civil service makes a big difference across the countries. This is my opinion, of course. I mean, it's just an observation.
Thank you. Certainly, I agree with you, because main problem for any strategy is human, how it will be implemented. You can wrote one of the best strategy in the world, which will be approved by the best scientists in the world. One of the 10 of them can involve in the processes. That's why we are understanding during the designing strategies. That's why we're probably working with our staff. The time will show are they effective or not, certainly. We involve a lot of partners. One of the partners, ETF, are the one partners, you other projects, as a U4U project, other partners and other, we trying to train them, not only train, to change their behavior. Because sometimes when we're talking about the training, we're just talking about technologies. But I think the most important thing, behavior, to change behavior, to change services, quality of services. In that time, that's why the best strategy couldn't be implemented as a good ones and be as a good sample. Yeah, good as a paper, maybe, which we can put in the library. And so this is one of the best one strategy, but it's not implemented because they haven't human resources. The main other one problem, it's resources, not only human resources for implementation, for managing all processes. As huge strategy is difficult to manage it. One of the most difficult thing. And now, are we solved that? I don't think. But we are on the process of solving that problem, managing, because I'm talking about about employment strategy. At the same time, our team, our ministry developing other one, demographic strategy. They interconnected, certainly, because we're talking about human resources, migration policy, etc. It's too difficult to implement, to manage all processes. Not only provided services on the ground, that on the high level management is too difficult. That's why I'm agreeing with you. The main challenge is human resources. We're talking about now about employment. We can at the same time talk about construction or other type of work implemented. So I'm agreeing. It's main headache for every government to hire, to find, to keep, to change their behavior of human resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. I see Anastasia raise her hand, please. Anastasia.
Yes, thanks for the very interesting discussion. I'm sure we can keep on discussing for hours, and that will be still not the way to find the best solution. Just my approach on that, I think it's also very important to understand that you need to kind of define in a way from the beginning the kind of criteria that you're trying to reach out in terms of policy. So then the evaluation, of course, is always a live process, right? So things happen in between, but it has to be anchored on some kind of initial planning. Again, papers do not always align with full reality, but it has to be a kind of, if I may say so, objectives on what you would like to achieve. So in the end, you can really evaluate by actually checking that. And that might be also the fact that you're talking about the relevance, whether that has really corresponded to the needs of the society you're trying to address, or wherever they are, the people that are relevant to this policy. Also, like let's say, whether according to the budget you had, the kind of results you have achieved, because that's also another factor in public institutions. According to the budget, it has really produced the results that has been produced. Also understand that all this policy cycle we're discussing about in a model, it's a model. But in reality, it's a live process, right? Also, you might set the perfect implementation plan, but then things change in the society. There's an event that have changed, how things work. There has been let's say a key factor, or a key, let's say, something that happened in a society that has changed the whole, I don't know, the balance between different actors. It might be a new regulation, I don't know, some sort of things. And then, of course, you need to assess the impact. It's not about numbers, right? The numbers might be nice, and that's perhaps one of the good ways to assess things, but it's not only numbers. It's about people. What has been the impact? And then there's not always one way to address that, right? So you also know to have to understand the ambiguity sometimes in how this impact is understood, but you have to take also let's say, the common denominator, how that has worked out. Because of course there will be fluctuations across different populations, different parts of the population. But I think also having a strategy on how to assess that is important, but you have to be open on what happens in between in terms of situations that have changed, that have affected that. Because of course there's never a perfect policy, and we also need to ensure that there hasn't been a very, let's say, bad impact on other policies. That's the other thing. So what we say in public policy, usually you need a policy mix, which means that something works efficiently in a number of policy areas. You can never have the perfect solution or a silver bullet, but you need to ensure that one policy does not deteriorate another one. Or when you try to see these things, you need to see whether there is a trade-off. You need to balance, you need to prioritize. That's also something, a values thing, but also something that corresponds to each different country or society as well. Just very briefly again, from my own experience, again, presenting my own views. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Ruben, please.
Yeah,
Final thoughts, and then we move on.
I agree that numbers, figures for our side, for Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. First of all, figures for Ministry of Finance, not for Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. First of all, I agree with my colleagues of Ministry of Finance when we're putting indicators, how many persons will be employed. Say, guys, yeah, I agree, certainly, because we're talking about budget expenditures, so we should understand it. That's why we design our strategy in such a way that every year the strategy must be revised as a minimum revised. And in our experiences, in our country experiences, yes, it's not just a paper that wrote and never should change. We have crises in that time. We design our strategy in 2 years. After 2 years, we have refugees crisis, other country wars, as the Ukrainian-Russian war, that affected on our labor market. So that's why we need additional 1 year to understand how to make solutions, how to do that, how to design. And that's why sometimes to say, when I remember it, when we discussion in government, is it final version, this strategy is a final version or not? Is it agree with other partners, government bodies? The answer is yes. By this hour, by this day, yes. But I don't know, after 10 minutes, what's happening? And totally happening a lot of things which totally make change, push that we should change. And now on process that discussions again. So it's a lifelong cycle always. Just for my side, and in this era, like for me, my view, this era is not so strategic era that before. Now strategy just the ways paper which wrote how it must be better. But just maybe sometimes it's coming as a wish, not more.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Muhan. And I would like to end this part with Ramelika, is our colleague's very kind of poetic description of the processes that you are describing here. And he says we should be thinking that all these policies and strategies are actually dynamic living documents, living bodies that adapts to changing conditions and feedback. So this is the conclusion of this part, and now I'm handing over to my colleague Begenc. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. Our last speaker, she's from Moldova, Mariana Crismaru. She is a senior researcher at the National Institute for Economic Research, and she will be sharing her experience of Moldova, how skills and labor market evidence is used for policymaking in the case of Moldova.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Thank you. I think we have not very much time. I will try to be as short as possible. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present our example from Moldova, showing how labor market and skills evidence was generated and shared to inform employment-related actions. Next slide, please. I will try to be faster because we have all the agenda. So just briefly some information about the country, because this is important to understand the importance or rationale of this study. So we have Moldova is currently facing a combination of structural labor market challenges. We have demographic decline and migration that are reducing our size of workforce. At the same time, we have a significant share of young people that remains outside of education, employment, education, or training, meaning that the existing labor potential is not fully used. In addition, we have significant regional disparities, and still there is a problem with skill mismatch. So the rationale of this study was that we need more targeted and region-specific labor market interventions to increase the employability of in this case, was of young people. So the study was conducted in 6 regions to identify employment opportunities, skills need for youth. It was a multi-stakeholder partnership from research, public employment services, and development partners. So donors, as you say, it was concreted as GIZ. So next slide, please. I'm not too fast. So it was the analytical framework was quite comprehensive, and that integrated mixed method evidence base. So it was quantitative and qualitative research method. We have done analysis of statistical data as well. We have conducted interviews with main stakeholders, focus groups, discussion with needs, with young people, especially with needs, and so on. So here we have 4 blocks that we build our analysis. So the first block is analysis of labor market and demographic trends provided supply side perspective. So it here we analyzed combined labor market indicators with information on employment structures, enable us to examine participation employment patterns, and also we try to show how employment structures vary across regions and highlight existing imbalances and the distribution of labor force. At the same time, as I'm in Department of Demographic Center, we have made short-term population projections for each region to evaluate how the available labor force might change over time. It was for a short period, and this was very appreciated for the local stakeholders, that they all know that we are declining, but when we showed the results or the data, they changed their mind. So as it is very important in the context of Moldova. The second block, it was analysis of labor demand, complemented the supply side perspective, and it was a combination of data sources. First of all, it was analyzed vacancies data from the National Employment Agency and online job platforms that provided an initial pictures of current labor demand, but I would say that it was not very informative. So we had to complement with analysis of labor market indicators, and importantly with qualitative evidence or information from interviews with employers, local experts, so on. So as a result for this block, we identified shortage occupations and emerging sectors across the regions, reflecting areas where labor market demand is increasing and skills gap are most pronounced. So the third block is analysis, also covered the policy institutional framework, including employment and youth policies, existing active labor market programs, and service delivery arrangements. So this helped to identify gaps between existing measures and actual labor market needs. And one of the key component of this analysis, it was to identify barriers to labor market integration, and based primarily on qualitative information. It was based on interviews with local key stakeholders and focus group discussion with young people, including needs. So we tried to find out how constraints are experienced in practice by all these involved parties. So mainly we analyzed, highlighted individual, structural, and service-related barriers, as well as regional and gender-specific constraints, because we have a higher share of needs among female. So overall, all this analysis of these blocks led to identify region-specific sectors, occupations, and skills needs that are important for each region. And after all, it was a validation of findings with key stakeholders. So next slide, please. So following the analysis, the findings were presented and discussed with, as I said, with main key stakeholders. that's to say that this step helped translate analytical results into more operational priorities at the regional level. This is, I should say that is a triangulation. These data findings are based on triangulation of data from indicators, from qualitative evidence. So it's more qualitative output. So the results or the findings pointed to both common emerging trends or sectors across all regions. As you can see, one of the most important sector was energy, particularly related to green energy efficiency, green energy, renewable energy, textile, social entrepreneurship, and so on, digital sectors. As well, at the same time, there was some region-specific opportunities were identified, for example, rural tourism, eco-agriculture, and agro-processing, local products, rural logistics, and so on. So these priorities were then used to design targeted training and outreach. Based on these findings, we identify the skills priorities, including technical and occupational specific, digital, transversal skills, entrepreneurial skills. Then this finding were shared, as I said, with public employment services and other local stakeholders. And this evidence was used to inform targeted training and outreach activities for young people. So it was conducted programs in different fields, training programs. One was facade insulator. It was organized boost camp, skills boost camp across regions. So we have already done some feedbacks or survey among beneficiaries of these trainings, and there are positive feedback, and their employability increased, so there are more employed young people. Next, please. So what I would say is that several factors contributed to making this process a work in practice. First of all, as I said, it was a strong stakeholders ownership, or they involved these main stakeholders were involved from the very beginning of this study. So they were not only as consultators, but also in shaping the study and the tools as questionnaires, guides, and so on. So this created a sense of ownership and facilitated the use of results in the future. Second, the involvement of public employment services at local level played an active role, that they serving as a link between researchers and employers, that they have good cooperation at the local level, and other, and also they inform us about regional realities. Third, the approach was demand-driven, that with the intervention based on identified labor market needs rather than on predefined solution. Another important factors, as they were discussed during our today's meeting, that the results were presented to the different workshops with stakeholders in a clear and usable form, translated. So we try to be very clear and very specific with which sectors, occupations, skills needs, and how to be organized and how to be done. So we try to be more as clear and as concrete as possible. Least but not least is very important, the support of development partners or donors, as I said, is GIZ in our case, that provided necessary expertise and resources, including financial one, from the very beginning to the implementation of all this at all stages. Next slide, please. So also I would like to say some at the same time with several challenges emerging during this process. So one of the most important was limited availability of disaggregated labor market at regional level. So this was addressed through information from qualitative research, from interviews with experts, with employees, with other experts. So another challenge was from the beginning relatively low engagement engagement from employers and some kind of key stakeholders. Usually they are quite reticent from this kind of only research. So as I said, active facilitation role from public employment services was good help for us, and we to have this. So coordination, poor coordination or fragmented coordination between institutions. Also, it was a challenge for us. So this was mitigated through early and ongoing stakeholders' involvement through this process. And finally, as from our previous experience, the limited use of evidence in decision making required to stronger focus on presentation, result clearly and in a useful way. So we try to be as clear as possible. So overall, I would say our experience shows that producing evidence is not enough. It needs to be structured in a practical way, in a very concrete way, communicated properly, and actively used to support implementation. Thank you. So I tried not to thank you for your attention. Sorry. It's not good to be the last one. It's not time. Sorry.
We did our best to manage, but it was, I think it was.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we can receive questions. I'm checking the chat now. If we don't have any, I will follow up on the question which Ruben said. The policymaking is not a one-time handover process. It's an ongoing process. And how you are on the side of providing data for the policymakers, how you sustain that dialogue in between policymakers and you, because Moldovan case is a successful case for us here, and then it would be nice if you could share some of the 3 things, let's say, that makes it sustainable.
I think it's involvement of key stakeholders, and in this case, particularly in this case, it was a good cooperation between 3 parties. It was like research institute, National Employment Agency and its services, and development partners, which provided logistical support. So the cooperation between parties, between key stakeholders. And regarding the policy, how to inform policies, or as I said, it should be, so we presented these findings to different meetings, workshops, and there were invited all the key representatives from key ministries. And we tried to be as clear as possible to show the concrete diagrams, results, and to show how me as a researcher is to inform, to show clearly and exactly what we have received, and to show how and to show that this is a problem, there are barriers, and if you do this, you can have this. So we try this at least. Thank you.
So you can ask your questions. If not, I have my own questions to follow up. So you find out some of the priorities in your labor market, and those are also aligning with the European outcomes, which are entrepreneurial skills, digital skills, those green skills. But you made it in your own Moldovan case, and it's overlapping with the outcome of the European research evidence, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to bring another aspect, which is about the policy making, which in the policy making or decision making science, it's mostly they tend to borrow policies from the successful cases, in the mostly developed cases. In the European policies, mostly implemented in less developed countries, or the countries that are not quite enough data to make policies. So in that sense, you find out your own solutions. But what would be the case if there is no evidence, like let's lack of evidence in many countries we face in that type of cases, and that how that the policy transfer and it can be landed, used in when there is a lack of data in some, not the Moldovan case, but some other cases.
As I said, you said about the overlapping, because these sectors are also evident in the EU countries. Because, as I said, it was a triangulation of data. So we in our team we have labor market experts or labor market analysts, and they analyzed also trends, regional trends. Let's say I said it's not only on one side it's expertise of experts, another side is what we have collected during our work. And regarding how it should be, sorry, I will. If it's not data, I don't know if it's not data.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm not understand what you asked.
Yeah. I got the answer because I just want to bring that policy borrowing and using that best case scenario cases in some other, that was the main idea, but
you cannot borrow and just implement one case in one country to another country, because each country has its specific realities. In our case, for example, we have, because of migration, we already have lack of young people or lack of qualified labor force at regional level. So we cannot borrow from other countries. So each country or each regions has its own specific peculiarities, or how to say. So it's you.
Now I can leave to Christina for wrap up the conversation, but also all of our speakers, you are free to join and leave your final comments if you like to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Begen. Thanks a lot. We have run a bit late, but I have to say that it was really good to have such discussions and animating after each of a presentation. From my side, I would like just to condense, not to take too long, in one main nutshell from the key takeaways from today is that there is no one single recipe fitting all in order to reach impactful policies. For sure, what helps the process is an ongoing interaction. So constant and transparent exchanges between researchers and the policy level, but we have also included the implementation level. So this is for sure benefiting the entire process. I wish to thank all the speakers for all the brilliant presentations, our moderators for facilitating the discussion, and for the contribution of all the participants. My suggestion would be to really continue the debate on this topic on the LinkedIn group. We can really add comments and continue the discussion there. I think this is a good platform to continue and exchange. As I said earlier, we will make available all the materials in open space, including the recording of the webinar and the presentations. So thank you, everybody, for staying, even if we are 15 minutes late compared to the original plan. Thanks a lot, and we keep in contact. Let's stay tuned for the upcoming activities, and let's stay connected also through the channels that the network has. Thanks a lot, everyone. Look forward to see you soon, and have a good afternoon or evening, depending on the time zone. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.